All right. Well, good morning. And for those of you, here, thank you for taking time out of your day to be with me. And then for those of you on Zoom, thank you as well for attending. Um, so I want to start this off with a question. How many of you have either dabbled in design thinking or used some form of design thinking today? Cool. So I think it'll be great because I have a few things here that even for the design thinking initiated, you'll be able to pull some things out of this. And I think also in terms of the essentials and how to implement in a realistic way, I'll also have some actionable tools and actual items to follow. Um, so first and foremost, though, I want to, just say that this is meant to push a few boundaries because I'm going to be speaking from my own Nike point of view, and that may be challenging, or that may spark some ideas, knowing that you're probably entrepreneurs or small business people. The one thing I'll say is that my experience at Nike was mostly entrepreneurial because we were in small startups within Nike. So some of this mindset and the scrappiness that design thinking affords was part of what helped me thrive within Nike. So, that being said, I do think too, given the case studies, you'll be able to find some dots to connect to what you're doing. So with that, I hope, first of all, just to lay out what you would hope to take away is that the tools of design thinking, and I think most importantly the mindset that is needed to implement design thinking um, successfully, and then also a Nike case study to ground this all in reality, so it's not just theory. So a little bit about me. I actually went to Cal Poly, graduated with a graphic design degree, got out in the world and realized that I was actually probably more interested in starting brands. And I quickly teamed up with a friend of mine who went to Cal Poly as well. And we started a small company, and we basically created a clothing brand and a brand. And through that experience, I was absolutely enthralled with product. And the idea of going back to my old graphic design job just wasn't that appealing. So for the next opportunity, I wanted to get into product design. So opportunity came along at Nike, and I jumped at the chance. 17 years later, I came out of Nike as a product leader there. Um, but in my 17 years and in introduction to becoming an industrial designer, I had a front row seat and practical experience just to learn how to the whole product creation process, from customer development all the way to messaging, storytelling, and launching at retail. So I really got involved and really fell in love with the product creation process. And it was through that I started to realize that there was a huge gap in pretty much everything that I saw. There was a huge gap. And what I'm hoping to do is through this talk is to help you avoid that pain, especially as a smaller business as you grow. So design thinking, why should you care? I think most of us feel the pressure of the change that's happening. There's a lot of pressure for us to grow our businesses, to thrive. There's a lot of competition out there, regardless of which area our business is centered. And also technology, it has played a big role in leveling the competition. So it's much harder to compete, and it's actually harder to stand out. From my own experience at Nike being a premium brand, 20 years ago, it was pretty easy for Nike to be a premium brand because they were pretty much started out early in the game, and they put their foot on the gas, and they really didn't let up. Part of it was their idea was to be dominant, and they did everything they could, from marketing, product design, sales, supply chain, to ensure that they stay on top. If you've been following the news lately, Nike has fallen quite a bit over the last probably 5, 6, 7 years, and smaller upstarts are cleaning their clocks. And the reason why is pretty much now for a premium brand, it's much harder to compete because the smaller upstarts all have a leg up and they have access to things that the premium brands basically had because of their size. So now they have access to manufacturing, materials, websites, all the communication tools, all of that has been leveled because of tech. So basically, this accessibility is a real big risk for a lot of companies when they want to stay, competitive and ultimately leaders within their field. And I mean, hell, you can even literally print a shoe right now. Um, so there's a huge risk of getting lost in the market. But let me first start with a story. So picture yourself a cold, dark, rainy spring day, and it's cold outside, but we're not worried about it because we're thinking about winter 18 months from now. We're huddled inside a warm uh, conference room, and huddled inside with with basically our essential our functional product team gathered to kick off a new season. So for a year and a half from now, we're doing the planning session with our functional team. And by functional team, what I mean is this is the team that are functional leads, development, engineering, sales, product, product design, and product leadership or product merchandising. And so those functional leaders are here today to essentially look at what the blueprint for what our products are going to be and what we're briefing for the next 18 months. And based on that information is ultimately what we're going to double down all of our resources, and we won't see the fruits of it for 18 months. And as we get a first look at these briefs, which are really important documents, as leaders, we look and what we see is absolutely shocking. We couldn't believe what we're seeing. And what we saw was ultimately these briefs absolutely suck. This sticky note is the boiled down version of what this big document with a lot of words said. It basically just said, do something cool, do something iconic, do something disruptive, and oh, by the way, do it for a runner. Our reaction when we saw this is so, so vague. What does iconic mean? How do we make something iconic? And a runner, our core customer, who is that? That could be anyone. So ultimately, what this brief was doing for all of us in the room, it was basically doing four things. It was setting us up for failure because as leaders, we couldn't make a decision to commit all of our resources for 18 months and be confident that this was going to hit our business goals, let alone our product and customer and um, marketplace goals. But two, it underdefined the customer problems, including any additional stakeholders that may be. So retail and any other, maybe even professional runners that were important in our process. So it didn't identify any of that. And it really was vague in terms of what insights that we as design, but also down the road, we could tell our customers, why was this product even being made? And then ultimately, this is probably the granddaddy of all problems. It was a solution looking for a problem. So the paradox here, when we're looking to differentiate and minimize risk, we need new frameworks. And that's where I think frameworks like design thinking come into play because they provide clarity, cohesion for all of our different functions and the stakeholders in our companies. And they offer better implementation, especially when storytelling and launch is really that's critical in today's marketplace, especially with online business. So remembering that initial runner, quote unquote, in our story, what made our stomachs drop because of this ill-defined customer is that without a very specific defined customer, it greatly limited our ability to create something new or interesting, or meaningful to our customer. Um, it limited us from finding the actual problem, and finding an interesting problem is really the crux of design thinking in my point of view. So now it's when we get into what is design thinking. And I'll start first and foremost by saying what problems I find with it. It's typically defined as 6 steps classically, and I think they've added 2 more because of AI and tech. Um, but and I won't disparage it because of that. I just don't think it's the greatest way to remember it and implement it. What I found is 6 things is too hard, or it's too hard to remember. So I would rather look at it overlaid to the product creation cycle. And what I've done is this is literally the product creation cycle broken up into 3 key categories. And then each one contains those 6 items of classical design thinking. And so I felt doing this helps me remember it, but it also helps me implement it, because this is not a one and done strategy. The beauty that I've seen in design thinking is that you can basically take each one of these areas and go deeper into it based on the needs of your season, product, your customer, and your business. So it's not a one and done. You don't have to eat the whole elephant, but you can really double down based on what your needs are. Um, and I define them first. So C is really the first of the process. That's where you identify your customer, you do your customer research, you identify all the insights, you gather them up, you boil them down to the very essentials of what the actual problem is and what's most important to your customer, but also the stakeholders that are involved with that product and getting it out to market. Then we move to the solving, where solving is really just about that. You take that brief, which is highlighted at the transition right between see and solve, and you solve your problem, working in quick cadence and not getting too married to your solutions, but moving as quickly as you can to find your ultimate solution. And then, of course, your story is where you take that and you launch it out to the public, both the product, but also the messaging and the rollout. So I mentioned these are the 6 items, a few others, but quickly, the six classical elements of design thinking are empathizing with your customer, then defining what those findings are, and by defining, that's also where I put the product brief, and then ideating, prototyping, testing, and iterating as part of your solving process, and then confirmation or implementing, and then, of course, on into getting it into the marketplace. So let's take the first. The scene is really the process of empathy. And empathy, as I've broken it down, involves 3 distinct things. It's looking, it's living, and it's listening. By looking, it's taking observation and amplifying that to a very you're looking for all the clues that may give you an insight as to how the customer is experiencing your product, service, or your brand itself. And you write down everything. Nothing is off the table. You take as much as much information, as much data as possible, and you write it down. And then live is where you, as a team, ideally a small team, actually live that out. You put yourself in the customer's shoes and you go through that same experience, again, collecting all the data that you can. And then listening, that's where you're reflecting back, and you're inevitably going to have questions. And the goal of that is to make sure that you're understanding what you're seeing. And there may be things that are bubbling up to the surface. That's your opportunity to confirm that those are in fact important to the customer. And then this is really key when you get to the scene phase and empathy, that produces the brief. And what I see is the brief is the culmination of that scene phase. And that brief, as you'll see, I think that is the most important thing in the entire process because it guides everything that follows. And it also guides where you place all of your resources, which, as we know, are really, really precious and finite. So getting to the solve phase, I'm sure you all are well aware of, the MVP and failing fast, learning fast, as I like to say it. And it starts with an expansive view. So you're not married to any of your solutions yet. You're literally just brainstorming, trying to find ways to to come up with a solution that's meaningful. And each time, each round, you're doing it as quickly as possible and doing it ultimately you're not adding a lot of features yet. You're just trying to prove your concept that was spelled out in the brief. As you go through each round, you're testing them by three critical criteria. Is it viable? Is it feasible? And is it desirable? So by viable, does it make business sense? By feasible is this is an inline, or this is something that you're creating 18 months from now. So this has to be something that's doable, it's scalable, and if it has materials, it's materials or technology that is off the shelf or is already developed and tested. And each idea you're testing, does it check all those boxes? Only if it checks those boxes does it move forward. So that's where you start to narrow it down. And ultimately, at the very end, you have one or two ideas that you've tested by these three criteria. And what I mentioned, that brief is really critical. This brief fuels your story as well. There's a really great quote by Charles Kettering that says, a problem well stated is a solution half solved. And I like to actually say that it's also a problem well stated is a story well crafted or half crafted. Because I've basically seen, and I've been in most of the projects I've been in at Nike didn't do this, and the team was scrambling at the end to come up with a story that was relevant to our customer. And it was really frustrating because we really felt like we were making stuff up. On the other hand, I've been part of projects as well where we really understood what that initial brief was, and literally the story itself told itself. We just had to finesse it a little bit and execute off of what the great bones of the story were. So this is really critical that defining in the beginning also helps your story at the end. So I'm going to start. Hopefully, you all have a pen and some paper. I'm going to show a quote, and what I would like to do is do a little bit of brainstorming off that quote. Probably seen this quote before. It's a pretty famous quote by Steve Jobs. I'll read it. Some people say, give the customers what they want, but that's not my approach. Our job is to figure out what they're going to want to do before they do. So what I want you to do is, based on what we've just heard with design thinking, what are some inherent flaws or risks in this approach? And read it again if you need to, but just brainstorm why this approach could be risky. And then I'll ask for what you thought. We'll discuss that together. Just come up with maybe 2 or 3 ideas. What are some ideas of why this approach would be risky?
You're solving problem the customer didn't think.
Right. Is it because you think you know what they need more than they do? What else?
It's really impossible to test.
Test to know if you're solving the right problem. Yeah. So obviously they they didn't follow this, or they knew something more that this quote doesn't tell you. What are some ways to avoid this risk? What do you think Apple did to avoid these risks? And well, you don't even have to write it down, just, kind of brainstorm them verbally. What was that?
Like build prototypes and put them into people's hands.
Testing. Mm-hmm. Yep. What else?
Just crunch some data to see, where were things going in direction, like what is gonna evolve regardless of what anybody thinks really. Technology is kind of creating itself, so we'll look ahead and.
Right. So like looking at consumer trends and and technology trends. Yeah, totally.
Maybe just accept that they couldn't avoid the risk as well. And once you accept it, you can just move forward.
Yeah. Yep. Anything else?
Maybe they actually did identify underlying problems, but they just used technologies that people weren't aware of yet to solve them.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he stated it a little bit wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it was that, but it was also if you look at what Apple did is they actually took technologies and solutions that others had already tried, but because Steve Jobs knew so what he doesn't let on here is he was a student and he knew his customer inside and out. So he spent a lot of time understanding who the customer is and what problems they had. So he could intuitively then take, those other technologies that failed with other companies and then bring them together and find an insight that maybe these other companies didn't find, like music in your pocket or, the camera idea, and really leverage those, and tell them and package them into an experience so that the customer intuitively said, I wasn't looking for that, but when I saw it, I fell in love with it. I knew intuitively why that was created. It was created for me, because how did they know that? So I think that's what's really interesting about design thinking, is that yes, it does require, if you're doing innovation, you have to be ahead of your customer, but you can't be so far ahead that you really aren't taking the time to understand what your customer really wants. And, to your point, sometimes you're looking for technologies that don't exist at all yet. Sometimes you're actually taking things that may have failed, but you're finding a new way to package them. Maybe they just hadn't connected them to a real need yet. It was a solution looking for a problem. So ultimately, applying design thinking, in my opinion, is literally looking for better problems. Because when we have a really good problem to solve, it's actually a place for us to differentiate ourselves, and it's also a place for us to lead because no one's going there yet. So this is where my case study comes in, because we're going to talk about football. And when you think about Nike football, we were literally a leader in most of the categories for outfitting a football player. So from cleats to apparel and football gloves. And the football gloves are not very well known outside of football, but to a football player, Nike, the Nike brand was really the first originator of the football glove as a performance item. And we expanded it from a tool mostly for wide receivers to pretty much every player on the field. So we were known as a glove company. However, we had a huge problem. So in 2008, we were absolutely struggling in the marketplace after probably reinventing it about 15 years before. We were number 3 in the market, and if you know anything about Nike, if we're not number 1, we fold it up and we move on to something else. So there was a lot of pressure. And the other thing about Nike is if we can't play in a premium space, we're not in that business. So we were only in mid to low price point, and we had to be in a premium spot and then leverage it down to low and medium price points. And to make the pressure even more highly charged, we were number 1 in apparel and footwear, which were far bigger pieces of the business. So there really was a lot of pressure for us when we were all combined as a business to carry our own weight. And then a little bit about how we were structured. So when we looked for insights and we chose our customer, these were the insights we were going after. So if you think about Nike, it's all about elite athletes. It's the Jordans, it's the LeBrons, it's the Serena Williams. We're finding those elite athletes. We bring them in. We pull in their performance insights, and then we create the product, and then we leverage that down and out for scaling to our actual customer who buys. But here's the problem. This customer, if you can call the person a customer, this stakeholder is probably a better word, they're not buying our product. So we're essentially creating a product for them using their insights, which are mainly for performance, and then we're leveraging that out to our other customers who are actually buying the product. So what we started to realize is that we were looking at the wrong customer. At least we were putting too much stock in this customer, and we were forgetting our actual buying customer. So we needed a tighter customer persona. And this is where that idea of the brief, we needed to tighten that up because a professional football player is much like a runner. It's too narrow, and we were limiting our ability to actually create a better problem and to ultimately create a more meaningful product for our customer. So what we did is we looked through our entire roster of customers, from high schoolers, Pop Warner, and youth to NCAA. And what we started to see is as we started to get more curious, and this is where the look, live, listen comes into play, we started to watch what all these various players were doing. And we saw something really interesting with these NCAA players. And if you look at this image, if you start to look at those socks, they look like almost calf high, or actually over the calf or knee high socks. We didn't make over the calf socks. So what this player has done, he's actually taken 2 pairs of socks. One sock is the part of the sock that goes into the shoe and has the foot attached to it. He's cut the other sock, he's cut the foot off of it, and he's pulled it up about 4 or 5 inches. And then you can see the white tape that he's used to anchor that sock. That was a customization that he did just as for something for personal expression, and there's probably a little bit of performance angle to it too, because he maybe liked a little bit more compression on his calf. That was really interesting. The other thing, he used white tape. He's got blue tape on his arm. Why did he choose white tape? Well, a lot of players, especially on down into the youth, they like to use these skinny bands, and they use them as accessories, either on their arms, on the wrists, or on their ankles. So that was also another choice. And then, of course, I just noted, the blue tape. Again, it doesn't have to be blue tape. He chose blue tape. Some players actually go so far as to wear sleeves. Some, they wear sleeves only on one arm and not on the other. So we started to see, and then from the gloves, the cleats choice, and then also the accessorizing with the face shield, the helmet, and the mouth guard. We started to pull together a pretty interesting narrative that this is really about expression. And with NCAA, it was team expression and personal expression. And the one thing we also knew working with football players is that expression is really about perceived performance. You know, that the Deion Sanders quote of look good, feel good, play good. That's a very powerful emotive performance enhancer. So we thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. We have something really interesting. However, we had a huge problem because we realized that now color and expression and accessorizing is really important to this player. But unfortunately, the NCAA had a very arcane rule that required every company that made gloves to make them gray. So we were completely hindered as to what we could do with color. And the reason for that is before this rule came into play, players would wear gloves the same color as the jerseys of the opposing team. So when they held the jersey, it was really hard for the refs to see what they were doing. So to solve the problem, NCAA, and it was only NCAA, it wasn't NFL either. They said, okay, all gloves have to be gray. So we took that problem and rather than realizing that there's got to be some way to spin this into something interesting. Again, just to solve the idea for expression, both for team and individuals. So that was really interesting rallying around that problem. And so if there's one thing that you can take away from this entire talk, it's this. Falling in love with your problem is probably one of the most important tools for you in leading and creating interesting solutions. And I'll tell you just from personal experience, it's really hard to do because oftentimes the problem means we have to live with a lot of ambiguity and we don't know what our solution is going to be. Therefore, we have to be open in that space of not knowing. Yet, there's a catch. So regarding design thinking, I found that for myself and also many of the people I've worked with, design thinking has been a game changer. However, design thinking probably in the 2012s to 2013s, pretty much every corporation either had a team that was implementing design thinking or there were consultants all over the place that were talking about design thinking and the wonders of design thinking. And for many companies, implementing design thinking was extremely difficult and failed. And the reason why design thinking failed is innovation really requires a mindset. It's about a mindset as much as it is about a framework and tools. In many companies, their company cultures were focused on the short term. They really didn't, as much as they liked to say they were about failing forward, they really couldn't tolerate risk. And because everything was short-term oriented, they didn't want to stomach the risk. Everything had to be, it was pretty safe. So it was risk avoidance and not allowing for the short-term failures, and falling in love with your problem itself. So what I would posit is really mindset is critical. And it's really the key to unlocking innovation and everything that I'm talking about today. And speaking of innovation, most of us don't identify as innovators. I know I can speak for myself that I didn't identify myself as an innovator. And now, having spent quite a bit of time working in these fields, I actually think that's a limiting behavior. I think it's a limiting mindset. We all are innovators. Yes, there are some companies or some skill sets like engineering and scientists who, in the popular mind, really are seen as innovators, whereas depending on our skill sets, if we're more in a support role or a process role, we don't see ourselves as innovators. But I think that's dead wrong, because I think innovation to me is small steps leading to some meaningful change. And sometimes those changes are product, sometimes those changes are process, sometimes those changes are literally just experiential. Um, so how we view our role within that process is really critical. So yes, we may not have innovator by our name as a role, or we may not work in a little standalone R&D unit, but I believe that we are all innovators, and this next part of the football glove story is the reason why I believe that. But an innovator's mindset consists, I think, of these three things. You're open to whatever comes. And as I mentioned, the problem is probably the first thing you're open to. It's you're open to essentially being not knowing and living within that comfort of living with a hard problem. You're insanely curious about why that is, and also about your customer and your stakeholders, and always constantly learning. And then two, you love to experiment. And this is where that mindset of risk aversion is really critical, because experimentation, you're going to do a lot of things that don't work, but you're going to learn every time that you make an experiment. So, we talked about innovation is really how we differentiate these days, because we come up with something that our competitors are not coming up with. And the paradox, to differentiate, we need clarity and the particular to why we're creating something. And this is where we come all the way back to that brief. The more we understand what the customer wants, the more we can innovate to their needs. Otherwise, we basically risk of being a commodity. And that's where that leveling of the playing field today is, that there's such a risk of being a commodity and not being a leader. So this is why we chase innovation. So going back to my case study, at Nike, our mindset was innovation. You think about innovation for Nike. If you go through this exercise and think about innovation for Nike, what do you tend to think about? You tend to think about the Nike Air, the Flyknit, and here the Nike Vaporfly. A lot of it is the big innovations around the big product platforms that get a lot of splashy advertising, a lot of social media, and they're flooded in our consciousness out in the marketplace. But in our case, a humble, receiver's glove, and for Nike, we were probably a $15 million business, which is just absolutely peanuts compared to footwear and apparel. We didn't see ourselves as that. We saw ourselves as sort of like this kind of ugly stepchild that, yes, we were creating product, but our product was performance oriented. Our player really didn't care about the flashy advertising, nor did we even get any advertising. So any advertising that we got was literally through use and word of mouth. So we had ingested that mindset, and we were absolutely limited by that mindset, being glove designers and glove makers, until we shattered this belief. So one afternoon, we were about ready to start our product creation process and start that briefing process, and I was talking to our business director, and I was pretty down. I'd been in the category, the football category, for a while, and and just had seen how footwear and apparel really received most of the love. And even to the point where when we talk to athletes, they would get 55 minutes of an hour talking with the athlete, we would get 5. And I just said, John, I don't know how we're going to create something interesting. They don't really care about us, the rest of the category. And I remember John just stopped me in my tracks, and he basically just said, Tim, just make some shit that makes them care. And it was really great, because it was so direct and just so to the point that it stopped me and realized, he's right. Like, it really doesn't matter whether we get 50 minutes or 5 minutes. It doesn't matter if they care or not. What we can control is what we do for our customer. And we had a great product, but we hadn't really solved the right problem yet. And there was something there. Could we go beyond performance? could we bring something that was maybe based on emotion as well as performance? So all of a sudden, our shift as a team started to shift, and we opened to bigger ideas and bigger impact, which gets us back to loving your problem. So now all of a sudden we had a pretty interesting problem. Remember, we had that gray glove, and we know that expression, both team and personal expression, was something that was really important to that NCAA player. So now we started to realize, okay, how might we find expression, knowing that we had a huge limitation within the rules that we had to play by. So we started to realize that this expression was our big problem, and but fortunately we also had a new trick up our sleeve. So gloves are basically, they're coated. It's a special material on the palm that's coated with a flood of material, and typically that material is a solid color. In this case, we couldn't have solid colors for what I just described, so it was a gray. But because we were changing to a more sustainable process, we were now screen printing a different material. And that screen printing allowed us to print graphics. So we thought, maybe that, the idea is not about color on the back of the palm or even on the front of the palm, but maybe we could create a meaningful pattern for our teams, and that would be their part of self-expression. So, and we would be first in the market. So we debuted these at the championships. I believe this was in 2008 or 2009. And we featured for 4 teams. We gave those teams special graphics on their palms that related to their brand identity. So in this case, it was the Florida Gators. And we were looking at photographs after the game, and we came across this photo, and we were like, oh, that's really cool. He must be really liking the palms that we did for them. But then we started to think about it a little bit more. We're like, wait a minute, I think there might be something more to this. And then we started to realize, oh, he's either a fan or a friend of Jay-Z. And he was basically flashing a symbol, the rock symbol, that was pretty common for fans and friends of Jay-Z. They would do it out in concerts, but celebrities would do it, on the runways and in photo ops. Which got us to thinking, and this is where the curiosity comes in. We're like, hey, what if instead of a pattern, we put a logo, and we basically put one half of the logo on one hand, the other half on the other hand, so that when they flash the symbol, they're flashing the Gator sign or the Alabama sign. So all of a sudden it becomes an expression of their team. So we thought this could be a pretty big idea. So this set a new process in place for the next year, the next championship. So for the next championship, we started working on this idea, but at first we slowed up a little bit, and we thought, wait a minute, these teams, or I'm sorry, these colleges have really protective brand teams. And these brand teams, they do not like anything changed, and especially we thought, taking their logo, and cutting it in half so that if you showed one hand, you'd only see half of their college logo. So at first, we were starting to limit ourselves, but then we just thought, you know what? Let's just try this. Let's just experiment. All they could really just say is no, and then we're back to where we were with the all over prints. So we went ahead and tried it. To our absolute surprise, all 4 of our schools sailed through, and we were absolutely gobsmacked, but we're like, okay, let's do it. And then the first touchdown happened. So this is Mark Ingram of Alabama. The very first touchdown, he literally ran up to the camera. So this was really before social media, and he ran up to the camera on national TV, flashed this sign, and this idea absolutely went nuts out in the marketplace. So, I mean, it didn't take probably more than a couple of days that our teams that outfitted the NCAA teams were getting all kinds of requests from other NCAA teams, And we also outfitted, we had a team that outfitted high school teams, select high school teams. They were getting requests. So for the next 2 to 3 years, we were literally getting requests from existing teams, but then also new teams, teams that wanted to switch from other brands to Nike so that they could get these new gloves. And then by this time, we had actually patented this idea. We were able to get a design patent. And now we had intellectual property. And so this intellectual property was something that we could leverage when the NFL contract came up and Nike was bidding on it, along with a couple of other major brands. And as it happened, the NFL chose Nike because we were able to offer this for all of their teams, but then also for their fans. So again, to give expression for their fans as well. So what I learned from this is literally, it was a simple mind shift that led to a novel innovation or a minor product. I mean, this was literally just kind of like dumb, in our minds, we were just kind of like, just like kind of playing. And ultimately we created something that touched off a cultural a cultural movement. And so I think to downplay innovation and our roles within innovation, we never know when we might actually touch on something that might have a broader impact, both for our business and also for the greater marketplace and for even culture. I think we're all capable of this. And here's the kicker: we never know when it's going to happen. We could have never have predicted this. But each time we try it, you just never know when it actually might hit and create something interesting. But in order to do this, every day, every project, our whole team has to approach it differently. So to summarize all this up, the takeaways here is design thinking and a mindset helps you find better problems, and which allows you then to seek better outcomes. And I would argue too, it helps you also create better stories. But all this requires a different mindset. So I'll leave this here, and I can also forward this to Madison. But I have some great, what I found to be really great resources. The first is a book by Google's former Innovation Garage director, Frederick Furt. He's created a great book that marries mindset with innovation. So if you want to delve further into innovation and mindset, that's a great book. And then if you want to dive a little bit deeper into case studies with design thinking, Harvard Business Review's 10 Must Reads is a great place to start as well. And then if you're curious about the killer or the product brief and what a product brief is and how to do it, I have a toolkit on my website. Just scan that QR code, and there's a great website with how-to videos as well. So I think right now, why don't I open it up if you have questions or...
So gloves went from 15 million to, or should I repeat that?
Yeah, same here.
So at Nike, gloves went from 15 million to what number?
It's hard to tell because I've done the research, and it was at least 2x within the span of 5 years. However, what can't be measured, or what it's hard for me to measure it, is the impact it had on NFL and NCAA sales, because the gloves really did have an exponential impact when it came to selling replica jerseys, and just outfitting more and more teams. So capturing that growth was really tough. But so 2x by what I could actually find data wise, but in terms of the true impact, it was probably a lot greater. And then there's also the brand impact that it had, just out in the marketplace.
Yep.
Please, like about the mindset.
Thinking about the mindset points that you were making, and I'm just thinking that that feels like such a hard thing to change. As humans, we're so entrenched and ingrained in the ways that we think.
Yeah.
And you explained it how it flipped in your
Yeah,
own
'cause
personal experience.
We embodied it too. Yeah.
But I mean, it also, you were in a giant organization, so it also required the people above you who ultimately choose what you're working on. So how did that work in that scenario? And then how is what you're doing now? I mean, is your problem really unlocking that mindset? Is that really what you're helping people do through design thinking?
First, yeah, I think it's twofold. One, it's working on your own personal mindset to be aware of how we limit ourselves.
Yeah.
That's probably first and foremost. And I think depending on your role and your skill set, you may be inherently limiting, let's say being more of a cautious role versus one that you're enabled to take those risks.
Yeah.
Just knowing that first and foremost, I think I'll just speak for myself, and I think most of us move through our roles with just an existing mindset, and we don't realize that we may be hindering ourselves. So there's that, and then there's the cultural aspect of where we work. And you're right, we were, as I mentioned, we were really an incubator within a greater business. So we could actually write a lot of our own script in terms of how we showed up, and also, we could. Our business was so small that we could say, you know what, we're going to do an innovative product this season, or we were going to, maybe shore up some franchises the next. If we were in the footwear space or the apparel space, they didn't have that luxury because there was so much riding on those businesses to deliver top line and bottom line growth. So in those instances, I think it still is required, but you have to be more strategic. I do have one example where we were able to do that, is that building a vision to, why, let's say we're not hitting our numbers, or we're just on the verge of saturation or oversaturation. Raising the alarm beforehand is really critical. But raising that alarm and talking with from the top down, because in our case, it was mostly bottom up, how we solve the problem, and allowing leadership and showing them like how we're going to be failing in a couple of years, which is really why Nike in the last 5-6 years didn't do this, and that's why they're literally scrambling and changing leadership, and lost a lot of great people. And
So is that to say that like your own experience and your team experience didn't necessarily permeate throughout the other parts of the
it actually
organization?
did by example.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think it was identifying we were able to show what could be done, and we were actually able to implement the same thinking with a much greater impactful product. So we were team sports, so we also did baseball product. And because of what we did here, baseball, we wanted to reinvigorate baseball as a brand and literally make a brand statement within baseball. And so they chose our group. This is where, it came into play. They chose our group because we could take some big risks where the other category, or, apparel and footwear, couldn't stomach those risks. It was too risky. So we could then create a really innovative ball glove, and basically shelve our normal product, create this vision, and then they would use that product along with similarly inspired apparel and footwear launched as a collection. And then that became our brand statement, and it invigorated not just us with the glove, but it also invigorated footwear and apparel. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But it's just, it's showing that we always have to be moving in this direction of taking risks. And there's likely going to be a place where that risk is going to be, there's going to be less impact if things don't go well. But we always have to be pushing in that direction. Anything else?
How did you get to know, sorry? How did you get to know your target consumer? Like in this case, you looked at photographs of college players, but were there a lot of surveys and going out and meeting these people?
Yeah, we were, in a lot of ways, we were like Steve Jobs, where we spent most of our year going out and talking to teams and players. So if not as a team individually, as either functions of design and product management. So we spent a lot of time with pros. Oftentimes they came to us as well. So we spent time with pros. We went to NCAA teams. We spent time with them in the locker rooms, and so we had pretty good access. And then of course the high school and youth athletes, we spent a lot of time with them. So we knew enough about them, like Steve Jobs, so that when we had this particular problem, we intuitively knew, okay, we know where to start to look. And then, yes, as we started to study some of the photographs, we knew culturally the context, and then we also knew how they dressed, so we were able to pick out those little details a little bit easier than just a layperson would.
So what you're describing is like design married with marketing, essentially, right?
Exactly. I mean, that's really what I felt, is that when we're looking at our customer, when in our case, when we're looking at all the different players we serve, and then we start to see this NCAA player doing something really interesting culturally, that's really the nub of marketing and design. And I guess whether we admitted it to ourselves or not, we were acting in that way. We knew that there was probably a way to marry performance and what we would call emotion, but really emotion is a lot of ways marketing. Yeah, great point.
And then how did you come up with the story based on those early um, impressions that you get marketing wise?
I mean, in this case, it was all visual. I mean, it was Mark Ingram running up to the camera. I mean, you really can't get better marketing than that. So in this case, the story sort of told itself. In that instance where we created a futuristic ball glove, we were able to essentially have a story about speed and the future of the game. And then the product itself and the presentation was so wild and colorful that the product emphasize that message, the message emphasized the product, and the two work together. So that was probably a better example, because by spending so much time on the front end with athletes and creating that futuristic ball glove, the story naturally came about, and there was no disconnect between what we were visually and intuitively, experientially delivering with the product. It had a very unique solution, a very unique feel for the player, that when the messaging came about, it didn't come from outer space. It actually fit like a glove.
I'm just curious with, what you're doing now, the business that you've built. How are you taking this experience that you laid out so thoroughly in the slides and making sure that I use sports analogy because it fits here, that your batting average is high in terms of who you're working with? Because I'm sure that maybe you can share an experience like this where not everybody, you can take a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. So
Right.
not everybody is going to be open to shifting their mindset in this way. So how are you navigating that challenge now using all that prior experience?
Right. Well, I mean, I'm open to talking and teaching anyone
Yeah.
who's willing to learn. Um, I recently sat down with a pharmaceutical product team, and fortunately for them, and this is really what sparked my idea on mindset, because they, as a culture, are from the CEO down. They're one of their key initiatives is creating a mindset of innovation. And when we sat down to brainstorm their team that was creating this offsite and me, they knew of some of my product stories, and they had seen how it was, very relevant, even though we're talking pharmaceuticals here, and that they had the mindset. And it really wasn't until they brought up the mindset that I realized, okay, because I was always curious why design thinking didn't take off and didn't hold. Because, I mean, yeah, fashion changes, what's the du jour um, in business changes, but I mean, we're humans. Tools are tools. Frameworks are frameworks. Yeah, we can call them different things, but why wasn't it successful in a lot of companies? And that's when it clicked. And because I've been watching a lot of major brands falling right now and stumbling, and especially post-pandemic, and even during the pandemic, most were chasing after short-term gains to keep their profits up, and they were basically becoming risk averse and short-term minded. Um, their stomach for creating innovation and doing some of this more kind of broader mindset work um, was starting to fall by the wayside. So when I married that with a workshop with the pharmaceuticals, it really kind of put the two together. If anything, I hope to shed some light on organizations so that they can start to work on mindset, because I really think it's probably the unseen opportunity for a lot of people. And it's obviously part of our, out in the individual consciousness of, how we can become better people. Why wouldn't it also apply for being better, better innovators, better, solvers of problems for our customers? So yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to change people's behavior, but I can maybe, just spark some ideas and, cause them to rethink maybe some of their existing mindsets as a culture.
So you've referred to Steve Jobs a few times and Apple.
Mhm.
So I kind of have like a twofold question regarding Phil Knight.
Yeah.
Was he a design thinker? And how did you see the movie with Ben Affleck and them?
I
Like, how-
didn't
can you-
see the movie.
can-
No,
Like,
I don't
did
think
you cross paths with Phil Knight? Like,
not a whole
what could you
lot.
say about him? Like, Steve Jobs is to Apple, Phil Knight is to Nike.
Yeah, I think he would be very similar to a character to Steve Jobs. And the reason why I say that is, he was a CPA, so accountant, but as a marketer, as a true product person, he knew product, and that's very rare. And I believe the reason why he knew that is, his relationship with Bill Bowerman. So, Bill Bowerman was the famous track coach of the U of O, who was literally the co-founder of Nike. He was probably single-handedly came up with some of the initial innovations around just creating a track shoe that was cushioned, that was faster, that was lighter, and building up that culture of performance, which led to the first jogging shoe. And so Phil Knight was also a big runner. And so he knew that runner's mindset. He knew he was close to that consumer or customer just because he was one. And then he spent a lot of years, selling shoes out of the back of his car. as well, going to various track meets and selling his product. So he knew what was working, what was resonating. He saw the failures, he saw the successes. So then as he rose up, and built the company, I don't think he lost that initial interaction, and it was just emblazoned into who he was and how he approached things. And it was interesting because Phil Knight obviously had that, and then pretty much every CEO was grown up from within the company, and they also were either designers, marketers, or product people. So inherently, they could kind of sniff out what was going to work and what wasn't going to work out. That oftentimes also led to problems because they felt like they knew product more than the people that were actually talking to customers. But I would say on balance, they did a good job of knowing the customer and keeping tabs on the customer, even as they rose to leading, a multinational corporation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how do you hold empathy at the core of design thinking when you're driving through global expansion and different audiences in different countries?
It's tough.
Without the brand like separating, like the
Yeah.
way one country will take something on, like even just this is like such a basic example, but even like I'm obviously Aussie, but living in America and
Yeah.
American resident, but we even feel things differently. So how do you like Asia and an American brand, like how do you keep that story and the brand message strong and identified, but then each market feels the empathy?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways you can do that. As I mentioned, it's about targeting your customer and getting it really tightly defined. But oftentimes a product is probably multiple customers. So you have to do that, the similar work, especially if you're a bigger product team, you'll want to do it for multiple customers, and then take that data and hopefully you'll find, because we're all humans, there will be commonalities with what rises to the surface. So that's number one. Number two, it's also understanding that if you're, say, an American in Beaverton, Oregon, creating product that's going to be sold to, let's say, Barcelona, it's good to do some research, especially, so this is an example of World Cup. So we would use a hybridization of design thinking for World Cup when we would do special uniforms for, in this case, it was Barcelona. It was a really good, this is actually how I found design thinking, because one of my close office mates, she had worked on this European team that did the research for Barcelona. And she said what they did is they created a small, like, tactical team, and they went to Barcelona and they talked to all the various stakeholders that would be impacted or influential in changing out the uniforms for Barcelona, which you can imagine is very emotional if you're going to be changing a team uniform, especially for World Cup. So they talked to coaches, equipment managers, players, fans, but then also key people within Barcelona that were cultural gatekeepers, or even leadership within the government. And they went with this approach, and they were just like, let's find out as much as we can about what's important to them about Barcelona and about the team. And they gathered all this information, and then each night, I think it was probably about a week's worth of gathering information. Each night they would do a basically a sticky note exercise to gather up all the data so that they could find the things that are rising to the top that were most important to that particular stakeholder. Then over the course of the week, they took those 7 or 8 key stakeholders, rose them up to see what the commonalities were. And this particular team started to realize that the ocean was probably the ocean and the sky, the color of the sky, and how it reflected off of the white, the predominantly white or light colored stucco buildings, that was really important and a key signifier um, for the city and for the people all associated with Barcelona. They identified this color of blue, and then they worked it into a concept, and then they went to each of the stakeholders again, and they basically unearthed the story based upon the sea, the sky, and then the surrounding colors of the context. And to a stakeholder, each one of them said yes. Oh yes, like it was just like an intuitive, like you're you know you're thinking my thoughts by creating this. So that's just an example, especially if you are outside the culture. Assuming that their culture is really hard, but I think in a kind of a broader sense, you want to stick to the more human, universally human touch points, and then maybe have we would have Asia and European counterparts, and we could lean on them if we had some questions or if we felt it was sensitive.
Amazing. Thank you.
Mhm.